Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Brady, and I'm joined today by Chris Brinlee. Now, Chris and I met just by happenstance when we were both helping a rock climber get to this very remote location in Arizona. He happened to be along providing technical support for the climbing, and I happened to be along as a driver to help support this climber to this very unique spire outside of Sedona. But Chris and I hit it off right off the bat. We had a lot in common. We talked about sailing and overlanding and travel. Chris is one of the most interesting friends that I know. He's an extremely accomplished traveler. He's learned a lot about himself during his travels, so we kind of dig deep into that. We also talk about his time sailing down to Antarctica with Mike Horn. We talk about his scaling solo summits of 6,000 meter peaks. Now, how he almost died in an avalanche climbing. Chris has been through a lot. He's also been through some real tragedies in his life with loss. So for those that are listening that may have some sensitivity around the subject of suicide, we do talk about that a little bit and that loss that Chris has had in his life. If anyone is struggling with thoughts of suicide, please know that there is help out there, and we are available to help in the ways that we can too. So you're never alone. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me, scott.a.brady on Instagram. I don't have a lot of skills in that area, but I just want you to know that there's always someone that you can talk to. So please enjoy this conversation with Chris Brinlee. And a special thanks to Dometic for their support of this week's podcast. I have personally used their fridges on multiple continental crossings and find them to be lightweight, durable, and efficient. Dometic has just upgraded their CFX5 line with their new VIP insulation panels, which improve efficiency and reduce power draw. They have also introduced a variable speed motor to reduce unit noise by up to 5 decibels. That makes a big difference when you're sleeping next to the fridge. The USB port is now 18 watts for even faster device charging and an even more refined fridge design and color. The CFX5 will cool down to minus 7 degrees Fahrenheit and has a 3-stage low voltage cutoff to protect your battery while running on either 12 or 24 volts DC and 110 or 240 volts AC. These fridges are durable and even won our most recent Overland Journal Editor's Choice Award. Find out more information at dometic.com. Chris, thank you so much for being on the podcast with me today. I have been wanting to have this podcast happen since the day that we hung out. I mean, that was like a totally serendipitous moment. We were both out there kind of helping an influencer, get to this rock spire in Arizona. I was the driver of the GMC and you were the rock climbing guide, and before we knew it, we were we were finishing each other's sentences, but a lot of shared interests, and I just find your story to be fascinating. I've learned a lot from you. I think that your travel has changed you in incredible ways, and I think life has changed you in a lot of ways based upon your story, and I think people need to hear it. I think people need to know that it's possible to achieve these dreams and to maybe even live a very unconventional life as you have. So let's talk a little bit about, recently you did an article that was titled Dissolution of Identity, which I thought, it's a really powerful read. You had taken some time away from social media, and then you kind of codified your thoughts in that article. So talk a little bit about what got you to that point that you did such a 180 in your life.
Yeah, so I guess to provide a little bit of context, when I was 26, I quit my advertising art director job in Los Angeles, took off on this grand trip around the world, which I thought was going to be maybe a short sabbatical from work, a little bit of an effort to kind of find myself.
Sure.
And then before I knew it, I had been going for a decade with little slowing down throughout that entire process. And
big expeditions, big mountains,
Yeah.
A couple near deaths.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the kind of impetus for that on one side was pursuing this more adventurous life. I had never seen a mountain with snow on it until I was 25 years old. And then I took a mountaineering course on Mount Whitney. And then 6 months after that, I quit my job and was climbing in the Himalaya on these 6,000 meter peaks. And
so that's the only mountain that we have in common is Whitney.
Yeah.
That's as high as I got.
There we go.
I've actually been higher in a car than
I believe it.
but yeah, Whitney was the high point of my mountaineering career.
Well, that's a great place to start.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. And that was actually when I realized that was going to be the end of my mountaineering career.
Fair.
Like, I mean, Neanderthals aren't meant to climb mountains, so like,
it gets to be a slog for sure.
Yeah. No,
but
good.
having that experience, I became very drawn to those pursuits in the mountains. And when I was in the thick of it, what I was experiencing at the time was this profound reshaping of who I was and what I valued. And what those experiences ultimately showed me was how much grit that I had and how much resilience I was capable of possessing.
Yeah.
And ultimately, those experiences allowed me to carry about in daily life and be able to just roll with the punches a little bit easier because I had experienced a lot of trauma based around my relationship with my dad when I was growing up.
Sure.
And I think because of that trauma, I had repressed a lot of my emotions and wasn't exactly sure how to kind of navigate feeling as an adult. So more often than not, I just chose to not feel and would instead just do. And in that process of just doing, it led me to these wild endeavors. As you alluded to, oftentimes more than I am probably proud of, I found myself kind of on the edge of mortality and having to confront that in very serious, real ways and evaluate my decision making from those points and going forward. But what I was ultimately experiencing, and I didn't realize this until much later and even just more recently, was that I had repressed all of my emotions, but climbing a mountain or achieving something big outside gave me a sense of achievement that was triggered by a dopamine hit that was essentially a chemical reaction occurring in my brain.
Yeah.
And
nature is healing in many ways.
Absolutely.
I don't think it can heal us fully, but it does heal us in many ways.
Yeah, and so there were kind of that dichotomy of experiencing sort of this healing aspect, but then simultaneously having these experiences that allowed me to feel something beyond the emotional repression that I was unknowingly producing in my life.
Interesting.
And that steered so much of my motivation, and I dedicated my time and money and energy into those pursuits. And ultimately, what they taught me about myself was you are tough, you're resilient, you're durable, you can handle a lot, but they weren't actually allowing me to address the inner causes of why I was going out there in the first place. And
why you were pushing so hard.
Why I was pushing so hard. And
was there a moment that you came to that realization, that you realized, like, I'm really running hard away from something?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so when I quit my job in August 2014, actually on the 21st, so just a couple days ago was my 10-year anniversary.
Wow.
For that.
Oh, wow. That's
kind
amazing.
of a fitting,
whole new life.
Yeah.
Whole new
exactly,
chapter. Yeah.
Exactly. But I ran to literally the edges of the earth. Antarctica, Eastern Greenland, these great heights in the Himalaya, all in an effort to try and discover myself, but ultimately what I needed to find lived within me all of that time. It had just been repressed. And on Halloween 2017, my dad died by suicide. And I was climbing a mountain at the time. I felt this gut-wrenching, like a wraith reach through my abdomen and twisted up my guts. I felt this visceral feeling on this mountain, and I just kind of rode it off, not really having any context or understanding of what was happening. It wasn't altitude sickness. I was well acclimatized. It wasn't anything related to fatigue or food poisoning. It was this very visceral experience. And I found out 2 days later by satellite text that my dad had died. And the timing corresponded exactly with that feeling based on the time zones around the world.
A little riff in the universe, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just kind of tore the fabric of my being in that instance. And because of the inherent link between my dad and me, I took his name, or I was given his name at birth. If not for the 25 years separating us, we could have been identical twins. We had so many similarities, and I looked at all of his traumas and his struggles and the ways that he had not addressed that and how they made his life so much more difficult. And I almost took like the opposite approach in so many ways to carve out my own identity separate from him.
Yeah.
But what I didn't realize was that in an effort to produce some degree of normalcy in my life, because of the trauma from that relationship with him, I had suppressed so much of what I felt from a child all the way through adulthood.
Sure.
And when he died, all of a sudden I was forced to kind of confront that identity and that link between us.
Yeah.
And begin to confront that trauma and begin to create some degree of separation. And for the first 2 years after his passing, I was so scared to even confront the grief for fear of where that might lead me because of that interlinking between us.
Yeah.
And only when I humbled myself before that and found that rock bottom and accepted that if I were going to have true depth in my life, which I find is defined by the connections that we share with people, if I were able to build those in the ways that I knew were important and that I wanted to experience that richness, I had to address what was happening inside so that I could show up and be vulnerable and communicate and create these deep connections that can only happen when you're willing to dive into these uncomfortable emotional depths of topic and conversation. But to do that, I had to look inside first. And once I began that process of healing, only then was I truly able to begin to discover what I had been searching for all of those years around the world. But just like in The Alchemist, that treasure lived within me the whole time.
Yeah, and a lot of people have mentioned that book on the podcast, and I know in my own life I've spent so many years striving. And I think it was, I have wonderful, loving parents, and it was never, certainly high expectations, but never, never that I felt was unreasonable. But I think I kind of took that torch myself, and I set myself up for unreasonable expectations. And then you end up working 7 days a week. Do you find that, because knowing you as a friend, from the very first moment that we started spending time together, I did feel that genuine connection, that you were making an effort to know me, that you were making an effort to learn about my life and to share your life with me. I could see that, you had learned a lot about what it meant to have a friend or to have a connection in your life. And I see that you do that with so many different people. So that in and of itself is very powerful. But did you find at the same time that you were able to connect with those parts of yourself? Have you been able to find that way to be that friend for yourself too?
Absolutely. And so much of that was rooted in me facing up and owning who I was and understanding where that trauma came from. And my dad was a very loving, caring person, and he, like, my siblings and I were like his whole world, and he dedicated his life to just raising us the best that he could, but he had never taken the responsibility for dealing with his own traumas, and so that crept into every aspect of his life and characterized all of his relationships. And from the time I was a kid, from like 5 to 13, I just kind of thought he was never around because of work, and I think that was a way for him to kind of avoid dealing with his relationship with our mom at home. And then from that point, from 13 to kind of 18 or 19, once my parents got divorced, he was dealing with alcoholism and kept getting DUIs and wrecking his vehicles and just being really destructive through his behaviors. And then after that, I was kind of waiting for him to die by suicide from that point, from 18 until I was 29 when it finally happened. So my whole life I was waiting
holding your breath
for him to leave, just holding my breath. And once he
That's hard, man.
finally did, I was able to release that breath and start to better understand him and appreciate the struggles that he went through. But then also see how that characterized my own life, and in doing so, be more graceful with myself and better understand why I had felt this need to run to the ends of the earth. And in doing so, in embracing that process, embracing that grief, embracing everything that was imparted onto me, and simultaneously all the ways that I had carved out my own identity despite what I experienced with him, was ultimately this characterization of who I wanted to be. And as I've continued this journey, I've been very intentional about growing into that person that I'm proud of for me, because of me.
Well, your friends are proud of you too, man. And it was interesting when I read that article. You know, I could see that it was this this moment when you were trying to peel away those layers of yourself. But I can see, like, in the things that you've talked about recently, is that you're still proud of what you've accomplished. But I could see in that moment you were really like, I want to strip away this thing that I worked so hard to, and it never made me happy. But there's so much for you to also be proud of, and you've learned a lot. And I wonder if it's possible to even get to the point that you were at without all of those trials and struggles. Sometimes you got to spend time in the wilderness.
Absolutely.
And we can look back and we can be proud of the time that we spent in the wilderness. I mean, I think about my own travels, you know, I just finished a huge 15-year project for myself personally. And at the end of it, I allowed myself to be proud of the accomplishment, but what I was more grateful for was the ways that it had changed me. The ways that it had made me want to spend more time with my family, you know, want to spend more time with my loved ones, spend more time with my friends. Because to your point, you start to realize what's more important. It's not like a fancy truck, you know, in the middle of nowhere. It's the connections that we have along the way. So
exactly.
No, that's a really powerful journey that you've been on. So
I like to think of it as a rite of passage. And in our modern, technologically advanced societies, we have very few opportunities to undergo true rites of passage. And what I realized several years down the line, probably around the time that the pandemic started, and I was able to kind of step back from what I had been doing and be a little more still, was that entire journey had essentially been a rite of passage to truly discover not just who I was, but how I fit into the world.
And young men traditionally in cultures all had a rite of passage, and those no longer exist.
No.
And in many places, what would have been the rite of passage would be entirely illegal to even attempt today. But if you think about the Maasai warriors going and killing a lion, or the Aboriginal young men that would be sent off into the Australian outback for months at a time without any supplies to survive for themselves, no doubt that they came back from that journey more ready to support and provide for the community.
Absolutely.
And I think that, unfortunately, in the modern day, those things aren't as available. Or, the parents are terrified that something's going to happen to their kid. It's understandable, but it results in maybe too much safety and not enough struggle, which I think we have to have some struggle in our life. Which, it leads me to the question: you went through this process of deciding that you were going to start hunting for your own food, and talk a little bit about, was that another one of those opportunities to come into touch with nature and with the struggle of that?
Absolutely. I think when the pandemic started, I had been focusing all my training on these mountaineering objectives, which at a certain point in my journey as an alpinist, I realized that the return on investment of that time and energy and money was diminishing. There wasn't so much that those experiences were teaching me, which was ultimately why I was going out there in the first place, was to learn something about myself.
I mean, and for context, you were soloing 6,000 meter peaks.
Yeah.
That's about as real as it gets.
Yeah.
So, those are incredible endeavors.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, yeah.
And those endeavors were really meaningful. As you said, they showed me so much about who I am, and they were such an integral part of that process. And I am so proud of what I've done, and I wouldn't trade any of that for anything. But when the pandemic happened, I realized that I had all these skills that were essentially, I had been orienting them to these pursuits of personal growth, but at a certain point they just became hedonistic, which is fun and fulfilling, but I was seeking something deeper, and I realized that they were transferable to backcountry hunting. And I grew up in rural western Arkansas, but always felt like a social outcast there. And in a way to kind of carve out distinction for myself, I had purposefully abstained from that, because I was like, okay, if people aren't going to accept me for who I am, then why should I try and conform to the lifestyle that you have?
Right.
And I think that was kind of a young and naive take, but that was...
We all do that.
Combative.
We all did that.
Yeah, exactly.
But, if you don't accept me, I'm not going to accept you. It's totally understandable.
Yeah, exactly.
I've done that. I don't speak for everybody, but I think most of us have done that.
Yeah. And as kind of time went on, and I found myself in this environment of uncertainty that was predicated on a bunch of wild things happening around the world. I ultimately was like, okay, well, how can I take what I know about mountain travel, and how can I take this fitness that I spend a lot of time developing and apply it to something that can generate sustenance and kind of have true alignment with what it means to be human from the perspective of literally sustaining life.
And humans have been doing that for a very long time.
Exactly.
And it's another rite of passage.
Exactly. And in many ways, I felt that my elk hunt in the tundra of the San Juan mountain range in Colorado was the capstone of my rite of passage. Not just from the perspective of going out and harvesting an animal and being able to feed myself and my community for months off of that harvest.
Sure.
But also from what it allowed me to experience from a perspective of emotional growth. Because that was the first time that I had taken a life. And simultaneously I had still been reeling with losing my own dad. And then just before losing my dad, I had a very close confrontation with death in the mountains. And so
was that the avalanche?
It was the avalanche in the Canadian Rockies.
Yeah.
And so there was this triad of loss that was kind of focused as an epicenter around this hunt. And it allowed me to truly feel all of these emotions that were embodied by this experience. And when I was coming down from the mountain after that hunt with the quarters in the cooler, I felt this metamorphosis occur in my soul, in the core of my being, that I've only experienced on a couple of occasions. And to me, that epitomized this journey of personal growth that I experienced in so many ways. It brought together all of these verticals that I had been pursuing and the ways that I've been progressing as my development as a human. And it brought them into this prism of reflection, and that was a truly transcendent moment.
And I would never recommend that someone hunt. It should be very much a personal choice, but it is, and you can spend a lifetime without eating meat too, and entire cultures do that. So I'm not suggesting that this is an answer for a lot of people, but for some people it probably is, because it's not only something that human beings have done for a very, very long time, but in my own experience as a hunter, in talking with other hunters, it does connect us more with what it means to be human. It connects us much more with our responsibilities to the planet, our appreciation for where our food comes from. There are a lot of people who don't like hunting but are happy to go to Costco and buy a package full of meat, and there's no difference. Either way, you're just not pulling the trigger. And I think it's the process, it's the struggle to be at altitude, to stalk the game, to be quiet, to not be on your phone, to probably be out of cell coverage entirely, to spend days in usually bad weather because it's typically fall, and then you have to pull the trigger and take a life, and then you have to take a moment, and then you have to go to this animal. You have to, of course, we should all show great gratitude for the fact that it is providing sustenance to us, but then we have to take this animal apart. And we have to bring it back to our family or to our community. And if you think about it, that is something that human beings have been doing from well before recorded history. I mean, it's a cycle that humans have gone through. And I think it's part of human growth. It's part of the human experience. So
absolutely.
Yeah. No, that would be an interesting one. Let's talk a little bit, kind of getting more, talk a little bit about some of the overlanding stuff that you've done. So recently you went to Vietnam and you're like, Scott, I'm going to get some motorcycles. I'm going to go rail around this country for a while. Talk about, how did that go?
Oh man, there was
a lot of smiles in the photos.
One of the greatest experiences of my life, not just travel related, but period. And in many ways, it was also kind of a bookend. When I quit my job in 2014, I found myself in the Himalaya, climbing, mountaineering. And then from there, I found myself in Southeast Asia, as it was a pretty easy transition. And riding motorcycles had been a huge part of my life growing up. It was something that my uncle introduced me to and that my dad kind of continued to foster. And so it was this experience that I had had with these two important men in my life from a kid. And then when I was living in LA, I didn't have a car. I only rode a Triumph Street Triple around.
Hell yeah.
And so that was very much my life.
Sure.
And when I left Los Angeles, I kind of gave up on that huge part.
You're like the modern Steve McQueen.
But it was something that I really missed. And so when I realized that I could buy a motorcycle for a few $100 in Vietnam, I did it in a heartbeat. And I rode from Ho Chi Minh City down to Can Tho on the Mekong Delta in the south, and then all the way up to Hanoi over the course of a month. And that was probably the full epitomization of that very first round the world trip, was kind of wrapped up in that. I think that's where I had the most emotional struggle. It's where I started having my eyes open to the rest of the world in a really big way.
You went pretty quiet on social media around that time. I think you were really working through it. So
yeah, and this very first trip, it was kind of in many ways it was like a bookend to my start of this journey of personal growth. When I got to Hanoi, I had essentially run out of money, run out of visa time. I lost my camera, my computer, my hard drives. This whole ordeal. And I bought a ticket and flew back to LA after that. But I had missed out on the northern section of the country, which is where I had been most excited about going. And I had been dreaming and scheming of going back up there to kind of complete that journey, to ride to the Chinese border ever since then. But after that first Vietnam trip, I found myself diving headlong into alpinism and dedicating most of my resources into that pursuit because of the kind of personal growth that I thought I was getting out of it. And so when I had kind of come around and started to step away from alpinism a little bit, all of a sudden it opened up more of my time and my energy to explore other things. And the idea of going back to Vietnam to finish what I had started all those years ago was wrapped up in that trip I took in December. And so,
what were some of your lessons learned, takeaways? You because you're an alpinist, you do pack light by nature. So, how did you kind of prepare for that trip? Because a lot of people are interested in, like, how do I go to Thailand or Vietnam, rent a motorcycle and go ride around the country? What was some of the gear that you thought really helped with that? What was the kind of motorcycle that you picked? What were some of the things that you learned from that journey?
Yeah, so I think that, simple is better. And in Vietnam, a lot of the roads are quite small. A lot of them have not yet developed, and so you're going to encounter a lot of sections of aspirational highway that is maybe just the construction zone, and so it's very kind of core adventure riding. Maybe there will be a little bit of single track depending on how ambitious you are, a little bit of highway riding, but very windy roads where speed is not really possible. And so I opted to rent a Honda XR 150 for that trip.
Perfect.
Small, light bike, easy to handle.
Ripping little dirt bike.
Yep,
yeah,
exactly.
Sure.
And it was the perfect choice for that mission.
And then did you go with a backpack, or did you have a duffel that you strapped to the back? How did you deal with that?
A travel backpack from Matador, which kind of had a little bit of a convertible feature. Able to tuck the straps away. And so I traveled over there with just that bag and then a duffel for my moto gear.
Right.
And I took proper riding boots and pants and helmet and gloves. Some of that stuff you can get over there, but I prefer to ride with my own kit and just I really like to emphasize the safety aspect when I'm on a motorcycle, and I find that bringing my own kit is a sure way to.
And that's a tough environment too, because there's so much rain, it's so humid, and it can be so hot that you really have to have very technical riding gear in order to stay cool.
Yeah.
What kind of a riding gear did you find worked best for you in that environment?
So I opted for a little bit of a hybrid style. I took adventure pants with built-in inserts that had decent ventilation, and then for my top I opted for just kind of an Under Armour type moto, like enduro
style
kit with durable enduro jersey. And then just the Crag Hoppers hard shell rain jacket for the inclement weather.
That's perfect.
Yeah,
I think a lot of times in the heat, you're way better off having modular armor, so that way you can wear lighter clothing on top of the armor. I mean, obviously, it's the abrasion resistance that a lot of times we're looking for, but sometimes it gets so hot that you're going to die if you don't get some airflow.
Totally.
So you gotta strike a balance sometimes, for sure.
And then with those roads, especially in northern Vietnam, very rarely were we even able to go more than 100 kilometers an hour because the roads were so windy. And so abrasion resistance was a little bit less of a consideration.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Spending too much time on asphalt.
And then did you try to camp, or did you stay in? I know it's so cheap over there. You probably just stayed in hostels.
We just stayed in guest
hotels
houses.
guest houses.
It
Nice.
was wonderful. And
I bet. I've heard that the people there are just incredible.
So warm and inviting. You feel like family.
Yeah, nice.
We stayed in these guest houses along the circuit that we did was called the Hajiang Loop. And so we did that, but with some slightly more adventurous variations throughout. But because it is a little bit of a known route, there are designated spots along the way where it's pretty easy to find a guest house. And a lot of those, logistically, like 10 years ago, maybe would have been tougher to find, or you'd have to roll into the village and kind of ask around. But most of these people have their places listed on booking.com now. So it's pretty easy to get them booked. But it didn't make the experience any less homey oriented. We'd have family dinners with them every night and all just kind of eat together around the table, sitting on these little wood
sounds
stools.
amazing.
It was truly blissful.
You enjoyed it?
Absolutely.
That's awesome, man. And well, and I think you're working on a piece for Overland Journal if it hasn't already gone live.
Yeah, working on that right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. So that journey will be in the magazine for those that are listening, so you can see Chris's trip through there. Let's pivot a little bit towards how we maintain our physical fitness while we're traveling. That's something that you're kind of like my dose of inspiration, because usually you're smiling at the camera, talking about your day while you're running, which I can do one of the three of those. Maybe I could smile and look at the camera.
I bet you could get two down.
Maybe I could get two down, but it would be impossible for me to do all three. But it looks like that you have found a way to make physical fitness a part of every day of your life. And I know that many people on this podcast, we've had many questions and inquiries around maintaining health and strength while we're traveling. So talk a little bit about your fitness routine. What are some of your go-tos? How did you get into like that consistency? What are some recommendations that you would have for people who want to stay more fit for travel?
Absolutely. I think it's important to note that I have a background as a high school and then collegiate athlete. And when I graduated, I pretty much stopped all of that training that I've been doing for most of my youth.
Yeah.
I was still somewhat active and I did different activities. Sometimes I rode my bicycle to work. I got into some extracurricular sports in the city, but I pretty much stopped training with regularity in my early 20s.
Yeah.
And when I transitioned from my desk job into this more adventurous career, pursuing mountaineering and storytelling around that, I did not pick up any of those same training habits that I maintained when I was younger. I was kind of just doing stuff off the couch. And I got to this point to where my objectives were getting bigger and more committing.
Yeah,
and I got to this point where, as you alluded to earlier, I was on this expedition and had triggered an avalanche and nearly lost my life. And after that experience, I realized, the things I'm doing out here are really serious.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be like pushing this envelope for myself, I need to treat it like I'm an athlete. And so that was a wake-up call. And the following year, I hired a coach that trained me specifically for alpinism, so that I could make sure that at least I could take that variable out of the equation. If I knew that I was prepared physically for these endeavors, then hopefully everything else could go a little bit smoother.
What were some of the foundational, I guess, movements within that routine?
So those movements I've continued on from that point. That was 2018 when I first hired the coach, and I have maintained that same type of training ever since then. And it's very much aerobic oriented, but still incorporating strength training in that to climb
you have to
a
be able to
mountain.
haul, and with heavy gear.
Yeah, you've got to be able to haul heavy gear. And the same thing applies for backcountry hunting. It's very physiologically similar. You're going far distances at a pretty slow pace, and you're having to haul gear. And so what that looks like from a practical standpoint is I will run about 4 days a week, and I'll do strength training 2 days a week, and then I'll have a rest day almost every week. And the mix of that, it's mostly aerobic endurance.
So you
running,
zone 2, zone 3?
Zone 1 and 2. And so it's that long, slow distance.
People have really learned a lot about that. The fact that you can run in zone 2 is impressive. I mean, you have to be really fit in order to be running and staying in zone 2.
Yeah,
that's hard.
Well, and the other thing is it's not.
I'm walking in zone 2.
Okay.
I'm hiking in zone 2.
Yeah, that's fair. But the more consistently you stay in that zone 2, and the more time you give it, the higher aerobic capacity you're going to have, and your pace is going to be able to increase.
Yeah,
I think a lot of issues that people have when they start out running or trying to get into training is that they have this idea that they gotta like run fast, and so that puts them into zone 3 or 4, and that is not building your aerobic capacity, and so ultimately it's not helping you work towards these longer endurance oriented goals.
As I understand it, and I am not a doctor and I don't play one on the internet, but the more that we stay in zone 2, the better our mitochondria performs to be able to manage ATP and to be able to manage energy and to be able to be efficient with the calories that we have that we're consuming. So it seems like zone 2 just really does give us that long distance performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the baseline for anything you're going to want to do in the mountains, because if you're going on a hike, if you're going on a hunt, all of that is predicated on being able to just walk for a long time.
And that's a very human thing to do again.
Exactly.
I mean, if you think about some of the hunter-gatherer tribes that are present around the world, they can walk with short periods of running, but they can walk for 15, 20, 25 miles in a day. And human beings got really good at actually running down their prey, not with speed, but they literally exhausted, because we can sweat.
Over the course of days
we
and
can
days,
sweat.
yeah.
We can sweat, and we can be very efficient over long distances the way that we can run. Pretty interesting. Well, that's cool. I've been hearing more and more about zone 2, and I'm trying to, change my own mindset, because I've always focused on strength training, because with overlanding you do have to be strong. We have heavy things that we're moving. We're pulling winch cable. We're shoveling heavy materials to get unstuck. We're hauling heavy bags on and off of a rack, lifting heavy tires, all of those things. So I think strength training is important, and strength training also helps us build a bigger motor. So
absolutely,
it just helps us to be stronger and more stable. But I'm learning that I really need to get serious about this zone 2 stuff. So
yeah, I think it's good to have a balance of both.
Yeah. No, that's great feedback. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to ask about, because it was just such a fascinating story that I got just a brief bit from you was, so you somehow ended up on an expedition sailboat with Mike Horn going to Antarctica. Like how, I mean, I suspect that there were very few seats on that trip. How did you get approached? I mean, Mike Horn is one of the, greatest living explorers, extremely accomplished. How did you get on that trip?
Yeah, it was really serendipitous. When I got back from my round the world trip after quitting my job, I got sent to the GoPro athlete, not the GoPro athlete camp, it was the GoPro Mountain Games to go cover the launch of one of their new cameras for a blog that I was writing for. And while I was there, I ended up meeting Nick Woodman, their CEO or founder, and kind of the whole marketing team. And we all kind of hit it off. And then a few months later, they invited me to go to their athlete camp in Alberta to just kind of tag along, write a story about it, but also get to experience all of the activities and hang out with their crew.
Sure.
And that trip was being co-produced by Travel Alberta, and they connected me to the tourism board up there. And so Jimmy Chin was doing this photo shoot for Travel Alberta.
And he's an incredible person.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he's done some writing for us. We've been
very cool.
very, very lucky to have his work in the magazine.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I kind of got connected to Travel Alberta through GoPro, and then onboarded with this trip with Jimmy Chin. And so we're doing some helicopter hiking and camping up in the mountains there on the British Columbia Alberta border. And from that trip, I just kind of got tied in with that whole Travel Alberta crew. And then also Jimmy Chin and Mike Horn have the same management company, who is this company called Inkwell. And so through that experience where I was kind of embedded as a photographer, I got tied in. And then 6 months later, I get a call from Travel Alberta, and they're like, hey, we've got this guy coming up to do some overland journey in preparation for some trip. We'd love to have you come photograph it. And that guy ended up being Mike Horn. And so I got to go
Didn't he do stuff with the G-Wagon for a while?
Yeah.
That's what it was.
So
he's a genuinely accomplished overlander as well. Like he seems to dig the long vehicle trips too.
I think the big trip that he had kind of done around that time was driving from Europe over to Pakistan overland, which seemed like a pretty wild journey. And so I got to ride around in those same G-Wagons around Alberta.
Nice.
And that trip was a little bit of kind of a soft launch for his pole-to-pole expedition.
Right.
And while I was there, he invited me to come join him for a segment of that expedition to cover it for a magazine that I was contributing for, Red Bulletin. And we talked about different segments that were an option for me to join. He had put Namibia on the radar, and I was like,
Incredible.
That sounds really
Incredible.
cool.
Yeah.
But when else am I going to get to go to Antarctica
Yeah.
on a sailboat?
Yeah. And had you done any sailing before
I
that?
had never sailed. I had never been on a boat for more than a day.
Yeah. Did you get sick?
Oh, yeah.
Seasick? Yeah.
I got so seasick.
Yeah, like Brian McVickers, who's on our team, he's currently, as we're recording this, he's about 2/3 of the way across the Northwest Passage.
Wow.
And this guy is like impervious to seasickness. Like he'd be he was the only guy that was willing to sleep in the V berth, and he would be catching air off of these when we're crossing the Pacific. And I'm like, I've got all of the Dramamine and the wristbands and everything. Yeah, I love it, but it's tough.
It's
hard.
rough. I learned a lot about myself on that mission.
Yeah, for sure. So what was the size of the sailboat?
It was, I think, don't quote me on this, it was around 30 meters or 35 meters long.
It's a big one.
Had about a
And about
30-meter mast, main mast.
About a 90-foot sailboat. So a proper expedition class.
Yeah, and it was kind of custom design, aluminum hull. It was, at the time, maybe still one of 2 ice-breaking sailboats in the world.
Wow.
And yeah, we were kind of the first ones cruising down. We took off from Cape Town and basically...
Oh, you did from Cape Town instead of from South America.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it was about 2.5 weeks to get down to the ice shelf, and then we spent a week on the ice getting Mike prepped to take off for his kite skiing journey solo across the continent at its widest point.
So you guys were around like I think it's called the Novo Russian base. If you were straight down from Cape Town, you probably were.
I'm not certain.
Like the Queen Maudlin Mountains and all that, probably.
Yeah, it was.
Cool.
There was nothing around where we docked.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah, and for 7.5 weeks, we didn't see another soul. We didn't see any land except for that ice shelf that we were docked on.
Right.
And then once we dropped Mike off, we sailed and continued on to Perth, Australia, which was where I debarked. That was 3.5 weeks.
And then did the sailboat continue on to pick him up on the other side?
Yeah.
Oh, how sweet.
So that was kind of the idea, I think.
That's incredible.
60 days later, I think he finished his ski trip in 57.5 days. He got picked up on the other side and then kind of continued this north-south circumnavigation.
Yeah, that guy's a rock star.
Yeah.
But what an incredible experience. I mean, I know that for me, sailing across the Pacific was one of the most formative and totally unexpected experiences of my life, in so many positive ways. Just I was able to read a lot. There was a lot more downtime than I was expecting. Lots of time just sitting on watch, listening to an audiobook or reading, and there was just short periods of time when we would have connection during the day. So lots of time without my phone.
Yeah.
So it was like a huge intellectual reset for me in so many positive ways. So what were some of the the things that you learned, maybe even from Mike? I mean, what were some of your key takeaways from not only being able to spend time with one of the world's greatest living explorers, but also to be sailing, to be going to Antarctica? What were some of your lessons learned from that one?
I never want to do it again.
I like that. I like
Yeah.
that. The honesty is good.
Yeah, it was a really tough circumstance. I was not a sailor, and we were in some of the most notoriously dangerous and difficult
Big
waters to
time.
navigate in the
Big
entire
time.
world.
Yeah, big time.
And
Roaring
so
40s, all of it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's gnarly.
a lot of my existence was confined to be inside the cabin from a safety precautionary
Yeah, they didn't want you
perspective.
falling off
They
the
didn't
boat.
want me falling off, because if I fell off, by the time they could turn around
No, you were
and
done.
come back,
Yeah,
I
you were
would
done.
be dead.
Most likely.
And
yeah.
so for about 3 weeks, I didn't really go outside because we were sailing through these really rough waters. And at one point we had this week-long storm that we got caught in with 60-knot winds and 30-foot swell. And we were just getting tossed around like a rag doll.
In a 30-meter sailboat.
In a 30-meter boat.
That's no joke.
And so I was in the forwardmost cabin on the top bunk.
Brutal.
And there's a little netting with a string to keep me in place while I was sleeping. But these waves, the swell was so huge that the bow was coming up 3 or 4 meters at a time and just slamming down. And so I literally had to stick my arm underneath the mattress and sleep on my stomach on my arm to try and anchor myself into the bunk to keep from rolling off and breaking my neck while we were doing this. And it was like that every night for a week.
Wow.
And then at one point I'd kind of got used to the boat just listing almost all the way over.
Sure.
And I was sitting in the main cabin area just kind of reading my books as you alluded to. And at one point we had kind of been tipping over a lot.
Heeling over.
And at one point we had heeled over, and this second wave came in and hit the bottom of the boat and pushed us over even further. And the window behind me exploded like that scene from Mission Impossible 1 where he throws the gum on the fish tank and it floods the whole restaurant into the street. So I was sitting there when this window blew out and seawater started flooding in around me, just completely immersing the whole bottom of the boat.
Wow,
and
that's terrifying.
That was absolutely terrifying. I
You're
was like,
the boat is not supposed to be filling with water.
Yeah, exactly. So close to like getting sucked out to sea through this window.
Yeah, sure.
And then, we that was close to nighttime and had to do an emergency repair, and they had everything on board, the materials, the plexi and everything to be able to kind of do that. But I'd never been exposed to that. I was in this little cocoon of what I thought was safety inside this cabin. And then all of a sudden I was awoken to how real of an experience it was. And
and they sound like a really competent crew, and they were well prepared. And all
absolutely.
That, so.
Incredibly competent.
Yeah.
But
what an experience, man.
Yeah. It was wild.
And then in your time with Mike, was there any takeaways or little pieces of wisdom that you grabbed from him?
Mike was kind of like a walking motivational poster, and it was impossible.
Well, it's true. I mean, he is that guy.
Yeah. You can't be around him and not be inspired. And just getting... He was obviously very busy in preparing kind of physically and mentally and logistically for this expedition. But there were definitely a couple nice moments where we got to spend some one-on-one time together and have some of these conversations. And that was really meaningful. Like, I was kind of the last person to walk with him on the ice as he took off for his solo journey.
Yeah.
And getting to just kind of have that off into the sunset.
What was that conversation? What was some of the last things that you guys talked about before he took off?
Just kind of the follow your path type things that you might expect. I think at that point in my journey, it was always uncertain, like where I would be sleeping the next week. Financially, there's so much uncertainty into living a life that is kind of off the beaten path as that is. And
that's about it, off the beaten path as you can get.
Exactly. And to kind of get to have that alignment with him and see the ways that he made it work through great personal sacrifice, but also sheer determination, was sort of just very inspiring for me to trust the journey that I had set myself on And even though it is unique to me in many ways, to just kind of trust in that process. And I think
it seems like he has done a good job of maintaining a high degree of integrity and authenticity in his pursuits, where he is working with companies. There are corporate sponsors, but he's really aligned with like the best of the best. And I think it kind of helps keep you above reproach when you're doing it that way. It seems like he's done a good job of that.
Yeah, and the things he sets out to do are very much his motivations. They're not influenced by these sponsors.
They come along for the ride.
Exactly. And in a world, you see it in polar travel, you see it in Himalayan expeditions right now, where it's become so commercialized.
Yeah.
And it's just about like ticking off these really ambiguous, hair-splitting records, oftentimes with huge amounts of logistical support in order to make that stuff happen. Mike is out there. He's got a team that supports where necessary.
Sure.
But where he thrives is just going off and charging headlong into the unknown by himself.
Right.
And he does that in a very genuine, authentic way that is so true to the core of his being.
Yeah.
And
that's
it's
kind of
such
inspiration
a
we
contrast.
need. And it's the inspiration that we need
Exactly.
in the world of, you know, of, like you said, influencers splitting hairs. You know, like I went up the left flank of the shortest mountain in the Himalaya. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that guys like that are, you know, people like that are the kind of inspiration that we need. You know, kind of to wrap the conversation up, because I mean, we could spend days talking about not only your adventures, but the things that you've learned. But I think one of the things that it seems like you've had an incredible journey on is also, in addition to physical health, your mental health. What are some things that you can share with the audience when they're in the middle of something really challenging on their travels, when they're in the middle of, when it feels like life is hitting you from about 16 different directions? What are some things that you've learned? What are some mantras that you've learned, or some touch points that you have, an anchor point that you have that helps you with that mental strength when you're traveling as well, or expeditions?
I also wanted to take a brief moment to thank all of you for listening to the Overland Journal Podcast. By listening to this podcast and subscribing to the Overland Journal magazine, you're supporting our employee-owned and veteran-owned business. Impartial reviews and in-depth content like this would not be possible without your support. If you enjoy the podcast, I think you'd really love the print magazine as well. And 100% of that subscription price goes back into creating the content like you're listening to right now. And as a special thank you for your loyalty, we're giving 20% off any subscription. And that even includes our special lifetime subscription, which includes numerous lifetime-only benefits. You can go to overlandjournal.com and use the code OverlandPodcast at checkout. Again, that's code OverlandPodcast at checkout, and that'll give you 20% off. I sincerely appreciate your support.
I think that, you know, resilience is born from being confronted with those challenges and then staying true to your course and your motive. And one thing that I've found that's incredibly important is that it's okay to pivot.
Yeah.
So often when we're going out and we have a vision or an idea for what we want to do and we want it to go a certain way, but oftentimes the reality of these circumstances are dictated by forces that are so completely out of our control.
True.
Whether it is like immigrations and custom stuff, if you're going country to country, as I'm sure you've experienced plenty of, or whether it's weather and conditions in the mountains, these forces are always going to be there to confront us. And earlier in my career, I would get so frustrated and discouraged when I'd like done all the planning, had done all the training, everything should have been going just right, but then it wasn't. And I would just get so frustrated that I couldn't keep charging down this path, and I would beat my head against the wall. And what I learned was that it's far easier and much more healthy to just accept those circumstances for what they are and then make a pivot so that you can continue to flow. And when you think about it from the perspective of nature, like a river, it's going to take its course. If it runs into a canyon wall, it's not just going to keep hitting that canyon. It's going to find a way to flow around.
Right.
And I think that's a great metaphor that we can apply to our own lives.
Bruce Lee,
be like water. Be like water. and simultaneously, we're going to be confronted by these challenges, and they're going to discourage us. And going with that flow does not mean quitting. It doesn't mean giving up. There's a reason that we put ourselves out there in these situations, in these environments. And when we're there and when everything is going wrong or shit is hitting the fan, it can be really easy to question our motive, why we're there. But I think it's really important to look back at the initial motive and our impetus for going out in the first place, and using that as an anchor point and trusting our own intuition and our own decision-making process from a point when we were able to be grounded and look back on those anchor points as we need to make these course corrections and allow them to just continue to guide our path forward.
That makes a lot of sense, Chris. I think if I'm hearing what you're saying, I have found many times in my life that my anchor point has been whatever the destination was or whatever the goal was. And it sounds like that what you're suggesting is like come back to the reason why you left. That, like what did you hope to experience and how did you hope to grow? And I would suspect that it's probably never more true than for a mountaineer or for an alpinist, because if I understand it, like one of the most important disciplines you can have as an alpinist is to be willing 200 feet from the summit to turn around and go back. And I have gotten summit fever most of the trips in my life, and I didn't have the same risks that a mountaineer does. But I would find myself pushing really hard. Even in Greenland, when we were crossing the Greenland ice sheet, we were in really, really bad conditions, and the risks were getting really high. And I wanted to continue to push. And I had to actually find a way to get some structure around the decision process so that I didn't get us all killed. And that was a big lesson for me.
Absolutely.
Like not only our own life, but the people that are with us are really counting on our ability to make good decisions. So that's a really important framing. And I appreciate you saying that, because that is part of the mental journey, is to realize, like, why are you doing this in the first place? Yeah, that's really good advice, Chris. What are some of the other things that you would, what are some of the biggest takeaways you've had from all of these experiences that you can share with the audience? So where are you at in your journey now?
That's a great question. What I'm finding as I've been reflecting on this past decade are a stronger understanding of my own values, and I think that's largely rooted in community and the people that kind of characterize and provide the richness of life and those connections. And there are other places that I've traveled to where I've found that those are very ingrained into the culture. For example, in Vietnam, we were having kind of some of these evenings in different cities along the way. And I remember showing up in this one town on a Saturday night, and the entire main street had shut down to vehicle traffic, and just the entire town was there moving around and hanging out. There were games, there were kids running around by the hundreds in little groups of 2 or 3. Nobody on their smartphone. Right. But the crazy thing was that these kids didn't even have supervision. They were just able to be out there in their community, playing around, having a good time. Like, there were talent festivals with these groups of grandmas doing dance competitions, and just
grandma dance off.
Exactly, like in the square, and they were just going through these circuits, and it was so enriching to get to be a part of just for an evening. And same thing in Japan, rolling into an island on a weekday night, and there's some big festival going on where the whole community comes together. And I think it's difficult to kind of find that in North America, but I also believe in the inherent value of that and in the cultivation and the creation of that. And so if you have an opportunity to build or strengthen those communities and to find ways to enrich in that, it's so important and it's so meaningful. And so just taking those opportunities or taking those initiatives to deepen that is so imperative, especially when we look at how isolationist our societies have become. We have
Very
to
much so.
take initiative to move beyond that so that we can understand our common ground and realize that we have so much more in common with each other than most people give credit for.
Yeah, if you spend more time on your virtual relationships than you do with your physical relationships, it's probably time to reassess.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of people today, they can spend hours a day with people that they've never met. And as humans, we're not meant to do that. We are meant to spend time physically sitting across from each other like you and I are right now, spending time together, helping each other through challenges, encouraging each other, learning from each other, being in physical space, eating, celebrating, doing hard things together. We're supposed to do that for sure. Now, one of the things I've been watching on your social is you've developed, and this has been another good inspiration, encouragement for me, is you have found a way you are writing 2,000 words a day. Now, you don't need to share what it is that you're writing, but is it fiction or nonfiction?
The book that I just completed the draft for, based on that structure, is a fiction.
Fiction.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So watch this space. I can't wait to see what that's going to be. But that's awesome that you were, and were you pretty much able to pull that off where you wrote 2,000 words a day?
Yeah. And
that's incredible.
That quota actually increased as I became more efficient.
Yeah.
I had this idea for a novel, and I had written an outline back in the autumn, and I knew if I was ever going to have any hope of completing it, I had to carve out some time for myself, and I had to create a structured discipline and be able to reach that goal. And so all the writing I've ever done has been short form for magazines or blogs, social media, things like that. And I knew that I was capable of writing 2,000 words a day. I knew that it would be somewhat ambitious, but also very doable. And I basically did the math. It's like, okay, this particular genre of novel needs to have 80 to 90,000 words. And so I broke that down. How does that break down into 2,000 words a day? And then I basically took my journal and I listed every single one of those days out. And then I told myself, you've got to do this one thing every day. And that was the same kind of structure that I utilized in my training for alpinism to kind of get out of some of these physical ruts, knowing that I had a big goal. It's like, you don't bite it off all at once. You take a little bite every single day, and over the course of 6 months, you're going to be super fit and ready to tackle this goal. And so it was the same thing for this process of writing a novel. And so I told myself, you got to cross it off the list. You can't go to sleep until you cross it off. Sometimes I'd be crossing that off at 10:30 p.m. because I got distracted. But as I got a little bit more dialed in my process and a little more focused, I'd be crossing it off by noon and have the whole rest of the day to go do the things I wanted to do. And it was an incredible journey and process to be able to commit to that discipline and then kind of stick to it. And so anyone going through a big project,
it was an encouragement. It was an encouragement for me because I've got a book deal going, and I was right in the middle of it with you. I was nowhere near as successful as you were. So there were days that I had to write 6,000 words because I didn't, and that's like you're asking a lot of yourself to try to pull that off. I would have been much better off with sticking with around 2,000 words a day. But, or even if I had just picked 1,000 words a day, it would have, because it was pretty weighty nonfiction. So, a lot of research and stuff that went into it. But that was certainly a big encouragement for me. So I look forward to hearing what the book's going to be, get it out there to the world so people can read that. How do people find out more about what you do? How do they follow you on the social medias, and how do they keep up with what you're up to?
Probably the easiest, most consistent day-to-day type thing is going to be my Instagram or my Threads account, which are both my name, Chris Brinlee Jr. I've also got a Substack where I periodically will publish a little bit more short form type stuff that's more introspective on my own takes on the world and things like that. So it's a great place to dive in.
Yeah. And
those are kind of the two that I'm more consistent about.
Well, Chris, I'm so grateful for our friendship. I'm so grateful that with you and I always scattered to the winds, that we both happened to be in Denver today. I'm here for the Overland Expo, and you're here seeing some family. And you're leaving this afternoon to fly to Turkey, I think is what you said. So really fortunate that we were able to sit down and have this conversation and spend the time together. And I'm just really proud of you. I'm proud of everything that you're accomplishing, and I look forward to seeing what you do over the next couple of years, and maybe we'll get a chance to get back together and talk about the next journeys. So.
Maybe share one together. That's
what
that'd
needs
be
to
great,
happen
man.
Next. Awesome, Chris. Well, thank you for being on the podcast, and we thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.